I'd like to thank the publican Barry, the Squire of Lambing Flat. We've got something special for him later. Welcome to you all, and thank you for coming. There's some of you are very special people to me. And thanks again for introducing me, Michael. If there is a thread that goes through my story, it involves introductions. Just at the right time in my life, I was introduced to two very special men. But let me first introduce you to the illegal practice of tickling trout. When I was about 11, one of my dad's drinking mates organised a tickling trout party on the Duckmalloy River, a few miles southeast of Oberon. And I don't remember enjoying a day more before or since. And this song came out of that. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. In full view of Charlie's Hill, a fish tickler I am. The territory's inspector is a wondering who I am. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. Ooh, I fished for cod in the Bidgie and on the Murray Weir. And you can bet your boots after heavy rain I could catch 'em in Lake Eyre. I fished for bream in Broken Bay and marlin off the coast. I fished everywhere but none compared to the fishing I love most. Oh, tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. In full view of Charlie's Hill, a fish tickler I am. The fisheries inspector is a wondering who I am. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. Ooh, I've been on prawn and trawlers in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and I've been crocodile hunting in the same general area. I've chased a big white pointer, and I've even harpooned whales. But when I want my kicks, I play my tricks in a creek in New South Wales. Oh, tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. In full view of Charlie's Hill, a fish tickler I am. The fisheries inspector is a wondering who I am. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. Ooh, I know where the yellow belly bites, I know where the rainbow's rising, that I know the yabby habitat is not so surprising. But when we get to meet St. Peter, we won't need burley, mate, because there is no doubt we'll be tickling trout inside the pearly gate. Oh, tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. In full view of Charlie's Hill, a fish tickler I am. The fisheries inspector is a wondering who I am. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. It goes on forever. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Oberon Dam. And that's all. Has anybody been tickling trout? Anyone? Yes? One, two? Not many. It's illegal. I don't know why it's illegal, but it's illegal. Don't do it. It's a lot of fun, but don't. It's a lot of fun, but don't do it. This story is the story of a very proud young man. He was the fifth of 6 children born of wealthy parents at Bellevue Hill in Sydney. The wealth had come from my dad's widowed mother, whose husband died aged 27, and who herself died suddenly in her 60s, leaving a thriving millinery business which she alone had built. My dad and his 2 younger siblings were not interested in millinery. They raged through the 20s and 30s, but hadn't done a day's work in their lives. So the business languished. But there was enough there to give her 6 grandchildren a very privileged upbringing. There was enough there for Dad to buy a rural property in the year of my birth, 1937, and the family moved from the luxury of Bellevue Hill into an old weatherboard house south of Oberon on the Long Arm Creek. Primary school for me was a remote one-teacher school, and my secondary schooling was at Cranbrook School in Sydney, where I boarded for 6 years, finishing with university entrance qualifications. This very proud young man left Cranbrook School in December 1954 with everything going for him. He made friends easily. He had a jovial nature, good behaviour, good manners, good appearance, which is still evident. Was without guile. The older generation approved of him, and he was among the first picked for cricket and rugby. Picture perfect, the kind of son we would all be happy to have. My domestic life developed well. I've always been cared for by a good woman, with my wife Helen seamlessly taking over from my mother in 1959. We had 2 children in quick succession and a third after a 9-year gap. Our 3 children came through the hazards of youth unharmed. All 3 married young. All 3 have good, sensible spouses, and they've given us 11 grandchildren. We've been spared the relationship pains, the estrangements, the many broken hearts and broken homes that are all around us. Wherever we look, just below the surface, there are lives in a terrible mess. But we've been spared thus far, and we're very grateful. But the very proud young man's working life was the problem. The world owed him a living, but the world did not come good. In the first 21 years of my working life, I had 14 different employers. Then at age 38, at an all-time low, I started work in the ABC mailroom in Sydney, and I remained for 23 years in the ABC mailroom in Sydney to retirement in 1998, age 61. Very disappointing for a very proud young man. It became a very serious problem when, in deepening despair, he didn't come home one night in 1974. But after hearing a news report on his car radio next morning that an unidentified man had jumped to his death off the Harbour Bridge, and knowing that his family would have heard that report, he returned home. This low point came during a disastrous 2-year period trying to sell life insurance. At the deepest point, in the middle of this crisis, an amazing thing happened. At home, we have a cupboard full of my silly little songs and poems. In February 1981, one of those silly little songs topped the charts to become Australia's #1 selling song for 2 weeks. The song is Duncan. I'd love to have a beer with Duncan, because Duncan's my mate. 5 years earlier, that song had come straight out of a life insurance selling experience. I was prospecting, knocking on factory office doors in Sydney's southern suburbs, and the owner of a heat treatment factory invited me in, and I introduced myself to Duncan Urquhart, about my age. He was free to talk and suggested we do that in a pub around the corner. And the pub was the Town and Country Hotel at St Peter's. It's still there, on Unwin's Bridge Road. Very prominent. We yarned about everything except life insurance. And I went back to see Duncan Urquhart 3 times before I realised he had no intention of buying any of my life cover. He just enjoyed the yarn. Driving home from the last of those sessions, I should have been miserable, but I wasn't. In the car, all at once, the music and lyrics came into my head. I love to have a beer with Duncan. I love to have a beer with Dunk. We drink in moderation, and we never, ever, ever get rolling drunk. We drink at the Town and Country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Duncan, because Duncan's my mate. I jotted down those words when I got home and tossed it in the cupboard. My encounter with Duncan, the first of the 2 very special men, was the only good thing that came out of those 2 horrible years trying to sell life insurance. I hope there's nobody here who's spent their whole life very satisfactorily selling life insurance. It didn't work for me, that's all I can say. But how did my song become a hit? Well, 5 years after that, after my encounter with Duncan Urquhart, Bob Hawke made his move to become Prime Minister. And in June 1980, prompted by this, I sent an audio tape of a song I had written about him to ABC TV, and they sent a film crew across to the mailroom and filmed me singing the Bob Hawke song. It went on national television as a novelty news item. And some bloke rang the ABC switchboard and said, if he was a horse, you'd shoot him. It wasn't very good. It wasn't very good. But it got me going. I arranged with EMI to make 200 custom discs of me singing the Bob Hawke song with a band knocked up from the very talented ABC mailroom staff. And we put Duncan on the other side. I sent the disc to every radio station in Sydney. Phil Haldeman and Malcolm T. Elliott were the only ones, to my knowledge, to play the Bob Hawke song. And one of my mates in the mailroom rang in and said to Malcolm, why don't you play the other side? It's a much better song. Malcolm Elliott played my version of Duncan in his morning show on 2KY, and it generated enough interest for him to interview me on air. Malcolm then sent out regular calls each day for someone to find this Duncan Urquhart fellow from 5 years before. Duncan himself happened to hear one of these calls, and as he said on air, he very nearly drove off the side of the Gladesville Bridge in shock. You would. Duncan Urquhart enthusiastically joined in the fun of October 1980, and it was then that I got home one Saturday afternoon to the stunning news that Slim Dusty had rung. I had sent one of my discs to a post office box address in Parramatta, where they used to receive truckloads of songs from people like me. But his wife, Joy McKean, happened to play Duncan, and she liked it. She asked Slim to listen to it. He didn't like it at first, but she made him listen again, as every good woman should. They were actually recording at the time, so on Monday morning they took it in, knocked up some chord charts for the band, and the second take was pressed by EMI and released as a single. And on the 10th of November 1980, 2UE listeners heard John Laws play Duncan 11 times on the first morning. He loved it. He really loved it. He flogged it. It put Slim Dusty on Countdown. Many of you would remember that, if you're old enough. For several weeks in early 1981, it put me in the songwriter's heaven. And the very proud young man was vindicated. He had at last been recognised. He was lifted up in a beautiful way by Duncan. Slim Dusty is a monument in our culture, we all know that. And I'm fully aware that what Slim Dusty did for Duncan is beyond measure. But as my brother said back then, that song mysteriously captures the character of Australian mateship. Soon after that, a nephew of mine came across the phrase, I'd love to have a beer with whoever, in the daily press. And he said, that song's become part of our culture. And a Baptist minister a year ago said to me, you know, that song's all about relationships. Never occurred to me. Had I set out to do that, it would not have happened. But the most amazing thing is the reaction we get when people find out that I wrote it. From the very beginning, Duncan was so closely associated with Slim Dusty that everyone just assumes that he wrote it. In the very early days, my kids would come home very upset when their schoolmates wouldn't believe that their dad wrote Duncan. Yeah, my dad wrote Puff the Magic Dragon. You can hear it, can't you? In fairness to Slim, he was in no way responsible for this. In fact, if anything, he attempted early on to distance himself from Duncan because they did not want it to become the signature song. It's a ditty. It's not a bush ballad. I can understand that. I met the Wiggles when they toured Wagga in 2001. Soon after they'd recorded I'd Love to Have a Dance with Dorothy. Have you heard that? It is beautiful. If you've got grandchildren, you've heard it. And they, the Wiggles, they were thrilled to meet me. The Wiggles. That's ridiculous. Duncan, the first of the two very special men, remains a wonderful gift to me personally. And this is probably a good time to sing a few verses. Russell, could I have that glass of water, please? It's your shout, Russell. I love to have a beer with Duncan. I love to have a beer with Dunk. We drink in moderation, and we never, ever, ever get rolling drunk. We drink at the town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Duncan, 'cause Duncan's me mate. And I love to have a beer with Colin, yeah. I love to have a beer with Cole. We drink in moderation, and it wouldn't really matter if he brings his doll. We drink at the town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Colin, 'cause Colin's me mate. And I love to have a beer with Kevin, his brother. I love to have a beer with Kev. We drink in moderation, and he drives me home in his big old Chev. We drink at the town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Kevin, 'cause Kevin's me mate. And I love to have a beer with Patrick, that's me. I love to have a beer with Pat. We drink in moderation, and it wouldn't really matter if the beer was flat. We drink at the town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Patrick, 'cause Patrick's me mate. Barry, where is he? The publican. I love to have a beer with Barry. I love to have a beer with Baz. He's a little bit tight-fisted. I'm sure he hasn't shouted, but he says he has. We drink at the town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Barry, 'cause Barry's me mate. And Jeffrey, where's Jeff? You'll do. I love to have a beer with Jeffrey. I love to have a beer with Jeff. He's a little bit like Barry. When it's his turn to shout, you'd swear he was deaf. We drink at the town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Jeffrey, 'cause Jeffrey's me mate. One more, Russell. Me mate Russell. I love to have a beer with Russell. I love to have a beer with Russ. He's a little bit like the other two. When it's his turn to shout, he looks at us. What do you look at us for? 17. Buy 17 schooners, all right? That's your shout. We drink in town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Russell, 'cause Russell's me mate. All together. I love to have a beer with Duncan. I love to have a beer with Dunk. We drink in moderation, and we never, ever, ever get rolling drunk. We drink at the town and country, where the atmosphere is great. I love to have a beer with Duncan, 'cause Duncan's me mate. I love to have a beer with Duncan, 'cause Duncan's me mate. And that's all. When the song first came out, buskers loved that because they could get 30 or 40 minutes out of it. When a busker can get 30 minutes out of a song, they love it. We've had so much fun with that song, believe me. Coming when he did, the first of the two very special men was an amazing boost. A great boost, though the Duncan phenomenon was, it doesn't come within a bull's roar of the second encounter just 2.5 years later in 1984. I'm very grateful that 12 years earlier, a 10-year-old girl introduced us to the idea of church attendance when she asked me, "Dad, can we go to church to thank God for our little baby sister?" I'm very grateful for the many church folk who stuck to me for 12 long years after that. I'm very grateful that they put up with my rudeness for 12 years and continued to invite me to men's breakfasts. Don't ever give up on that person who will not go to those things. Even when they tell you to go to hell, don't give up on him, please. I'm very grateful for those 12 years of reluctant church attendance, dutifully taking our children to Sunday school. Because while I was politely waiting to take them home, I learnt a lot. Throughout those 12 years, I believed that I was a Christian. I believed also that I was self-sufficient, and the Duncan phenomenon exaggerated that belief. So the very proud young man scoffed at the notion that he was sinful. I believed, quite rightly, that I was a good person. I really didn't need God in my situation. If anything, God needed me. It was the God-bothering people, with all their talk of sin and guilt, who had it wrong. I was okay. At the end of those 12 years, that very widely held worldview of mine took a direct hit and sank. The shipwreck happened in the middle of a sermon with the reading of a Bible verse, and Jesus' statement finishes with these words, "He has already crossed over from death to life." In my mind, I turned and faced this perfect man, Jesus, for the very first time. Everything I had been taught fell into place. In my mind, I had killed him. The very proud young man's sin, as much as anybody else's, was responsible for Jesus' death. In my mind, I crashed to my knees with the weight of guilt. I had been found guilty in God's court, and I had to pay the price. But while I was still rejecting him, Jesus paid the price for me. He died the death that was my due. He laid down his life so that I might have it. He sold me life insurance. How's that for giving a new meaning to the term life insurance? The second of the two men sold me a life insurance policy with a one-off premium paid by him. It cost him his life. Now that is real life insurance. Yes, it's the perfect insurance. Greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his mates. And Jesus was brought back to life. I was brought back to life. Listen to it, I was born again. It does happen. And the direct responsibility for Jesus' death forgiven. And the staggering guilt gone. It is finished. One Bible verse shifted me from skeptic to believer 100%. At age 47, I had crossed over. And just like my conception, I had nothing to do with it. My conception, my conversion, same story. If this is a totally new idea to you, don't worry about it. There is nothing to worry about. It's finished. Very ironically, not long after the song was a hit, Duncan Urquhart, the man, was hit by a sudden heart attack and was killed in his early 50s, leaving a wife and 2 teenage kids. It is true. I am not making this up. I do not know whether or not Duncan's life was insured. I went out to see him 3 times, and I truly believe that I did not ask him. What sort of a salesman was that? I do not know either if Duncan knew that Jesus died for him too. It did not occur to me to ask him that. Why would I? What I do know is that in 1984, Jesus said to me, as he said to the criminal on the Roman cross beside him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." In a very real sense, I'm there with him now. I received a rock-solid belief in the biblical Jesus, and since then I have had an ongoing personal relationship with him. Jesus is my best mate. In a very real sense also, that very proud young man died. What in God's name does that mean? You ask. Thinks. A grain of wheat dropped in the soil, given the right conditions, a new plant, a new life, a new creation. And the old grain itself decomposes, it dies. Doesn't it? Of course it does. It's a perfect image. That is Jesus' teaching, not mine. It is my considered view that all Jesus' teachings are perfect. For 34 years, I've been faithfully taught that the biblical Jesus is God. And I believe that. For 22 of those 34 years, I've had a personal relationship with him. For the love of God, why would I not follow this man? For the love of the same God, Why would you not follow this man? Think about it. It costs nothing. It's the classic life and death offer. To the extent that it's your decision, you may refuse it, and most people do. There's a story in the Bible about a man born blind who was healed by Jesus. Like that man, an adult convert like me can truthfully say, one thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Jesus has been first in my life since the Spirit of God introduced me to him in 1984. I was a very popular, good young man, but I was lost. Well, what does that mean? It means that life had no meaning. It was all questions and no answers. It means that if there was a way that leads to meaning, to purpose, to hope, then I was lost. Jesus said that he came to seek and to save the lost. The job has been done. It is finished. And I now have a sure hope, and nothing will ever take it away. Don't get me wrong, I'm not protected from any one of the possible disasters we all face in this life. But my life is now filled with meaning and a certain sure hope. To conclude, these days I'm often introduced to people as the bloke who wrote Duncan. They enjoy it, and of course I enjoy it. I love being introduced to people as the bloke who wrote Duncan. It's a truly wonderful experience for me personally, and remains so. But listen to this for an introduction. I believe that on the day that I take my last breath, which could be very soon, of course, I believe that Jesus has already said, Father, this is Pat Alexander, I died for him. Before we throw it open for questions, I want to sing a song that I wrote shortly before my conversion. The man who wrote this song certainly liked what he could see, but he didn't have a clue what was coming. With leg rope and lariat, please tie me to thee, Lord Jesus. Teach me to follow and teach me to lead, dear Lord. Tie me to thee lest I stray. Teach me to trust and obey. The tighter you tie me, the freer I'll be. Tie me to thee, dear Lord. With leg rope and lariat, please tie me to thee. Lasso a new disciple, but just let me stay with the rest of the herd. Teach me your word, dear Lord. Some seem to think it odd that I believe in God. With leg rope and lariat, please tie me to thee, dear Lord. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Auburn Dam. In full view of Charlie's Hill, a fish tickler I am. The fisheries inspector is a wondering who I am. Tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Auburn Dam. Ooh, I fished for cod in the Flinders and on the Murray Weir. You can bet your boots off the heavy rain I could catch 'em in Lake Anne. I've fished for brim in Broken Bay and marlin off the coast. I've fished everywhere, but none compared to the fishing I love most. Oh, 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 tickling trout in the Long Arm Creek above the Auburn Dam. In full view of Charlie's Hill, a fish tickler I am. The fisheries inspector is the wondering who I am. Tickling trout in the Long